Oliver's world ended on a rainy Oregon night, leaving only the phantom ache of a lost pirouette. Once a celebrated dancer, he now faced a life confined to sterile walls. But when an unexpected discovery unveils a new, silent rhythm, he's forced to confront whether his greatest performance still lies ahead, defying despair. The ghost of a pirouette lived in his left leg. It was a cruel, beautiful phantom, a memory of muscle and bone that was no longer there. 18 months after the rainy Oregon night that had cleaved his life in two, Oliver, at 34, found his world confined to the sterile beige walls of the Willow Creek Rehabilitation Center. Outside his window, the pines stood tall and indifferent against a vast sky, a landscape of freedom he could no longer access. Inside, the most persistent sensation was the ghost, a tingling echo in the empty space below his knee, a muscle memory of a leap that ended in a tangle of metal and shattered glass. Tonight, the ghost was particularly restless. Propped up in his bed, Oliver held a tablet, its cold light illuminating his face. On the screen, the curtain was rising on the fall gala of his former company, the Portland Contemporary Ballet. He knew the choreography by heart. He had been slated to dance the lead. His fingers, resting on the crisp hospital sheets, twitched, tracing the familiar counts. And 1-2 lift. Then he saw him, the young man who had taken his place. He was all fluid power and explosive grace, a marvel of sinew and spirit. When he launched into the grand jeté, the one Oliver had spent a decade perfecting, something sharp and hot pierced Oliver's chest. It wasn't just envy, it was a profound sense of erasure. He was watching his own soul being performed by another body. The thunderous applause from the digital audience sounded like handfuls of dirt being thrown on a coffin. With a sharp jab of his thumb, he blacked out the screen. The applause vanished, leaving only the hum of the building's ventilation and the frantic beat of his own heart. In the dark, reflective surface of the tablet, his face was a pale mask, and below it, fused to his silhouette, was the cold, metallic glint of the wheelchair waiting beside his bed. The ghost in his leg finally fell silent, leaving only the heavy, unbearable weight of what was real. To fight back against the encroaching emptiness, a void that threatened to swallow him whole, Oliver started a secret project. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to let his art die within him. Every afternoon, around 3, when the hum of Willow Creek settled into a predictable rhythm, he would wheel himself down to the old physical therapy room at the far end of the West Wing. It was a forgotten space, smelling faintly of dust and antiseptic wipes, its equipment draped in white sheets like slumbering ghosts. Here, he gathered his unlikely troupe. There was Maria, a 62-year-old former high school history teacher whose sharp, cynical tongue was a shield for the loneliness that had set in after the stroke that put her in a wheelchair. And there was Kyle, a 19-year-old athlete, broad-shouldered and once brimming with restless energy, now paralyzed from the waist down after a reckless dive into a shallow lake. They were a trio of broken bodies, united by the shared geography of loss. Oliver became their silent conductor. There was no music. The facility's budget didn't stretch to such luxuries, and besides, Oliver didn't want it. Music would have reminded him too keenly of everything he'd lost. Instead, he used his voice, a low and steady metronome. 5, 6, turn and sweep the arm, 7, 8. He taught them to find a new kind of dance. It wasn't about legs. It was about the eloquent curve of a spine, the sharp, percussive thrust of an elbow, the graceful glide and spin of the chairs themselves. He showed them how to use the wheels not as a prison but as a partner. At first, Maria was his most vocal critic. A ballet for cripples. What's next, Oliver? A choir for the mute, she'd scoff, her arms crossed stubbornly. But Oliver didn't argue. He simply met her gaze with an intensity that brooked no dissent, a fire in his eyes that she hadn't seen in anyone, let alone herself, for years. He'd demonstrate a move, his own upper body a study in controlled power, and slowly, reluctantly, she would follow. Then, one afternoon, as they practiced a synchronized turn, She caught her own reflection in the dusty wall mirror. For a fleeting moment, she didn't see a broken old woman. She saw movement, grace, and strength. She saw life. And from that day on, her cynicism gave way to a fierce, quiet focus. Kyle, who had been lost in a fog of teenage despair, found a new outlet for his physical discipline. His powerful arms carving shapes in the air that spoke of a longing and a fight he couldn't put into words. The silent room was no longer silent. It was filled with the whir of wheels, the soft scuff of rubber on linoleum, and the shared breath of three people rediscovering the poetry of their own bodies. Leo, a 38-year-old music therapist and independent composer, visited Willow Creek every Tuesday. His grandfather, a man whose world had been slowly shrinking due to Parkinson's, was a resident on the third floor. Leo's visits were a ritual of quiet companionship, often filled with the soft strumming of his guitar, a small attempt to build a bridge across the chasm of his grandfather's disease. One Tuesday, he arrived earlier than usual, the afternoon sun casting long shadows down the hallways. As he walked past the west wing, a sound, faint yet distinct, snagged his attention. It wasn't a melody. It was a rhythm, raw and elemental. The soft, percussive hiss of rubber wheels on linoleum, punctuated by a low, commanding voice counting out a beat. 5, 6 turn, now lift through the chest, 7, 8. It was disciplined, precise, and utterly compelling. Curiosity overriding his usual path, Leo followed the sound to its source. The old, disused therapy room. The door was slightly ajar. He peered through the small, wire-reinforced glass window, careful not to be seen. What he saw inside made him freeze, his hand still on the doorknob. 3 wheelchairs were moving in a stark, beautiful formation. They weren't just being pushed, they were being danced. They spun in unison, their movements sharp and deliberate, their occupants' arms carving powerful arcs through the dusty air. At their center, conducting this silent orchestra, was a man with a fierce focus in his eyes and one leg. Leo watched, mesmerized, as the man guided them through a sequence, a gesture of collective yearning, followed by a sudden, defiant halt. There was no music, yet Leo could hear it. A powerful, unwritten score thrummed in the space between them. It was a symphony of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. He saw the sweat on their brows, the intense concentration that tightened their jaws, and the flicker of something profound in their eyes, a shared purpose. It was art stripped down to its most essential core, emotion given form. Leo, a man who spent his life translating feelings into notes, felt a wave of awe wash over him. He wasn't just looking at rehabilitation, he was witnessing creation. He stood there for a full 5 minutes, a silent, unseen audience to a performance more moving than any he had ever witnessed on a grand stage. Leo didn't interrupt. He pulled back from the door, the image seared into his mind, and continued on to his grandfather's room, the ghost of that silent rhythm replaying in his head. The encounter felt too private, too sacred to be disturbed by a stranger's intrusion. A few days later, he orchestrated a chance meeting. He found Oliver in the center's public garden, sitting alone by a bed of late-blooming roses, his gaze lost somewhere in the distant green hills. Leo approached not as a spy but as a fellow artist. He sat on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "They say music can tell stories without words," Leo began, his voice calm and unassuming. Oliver turned, his expression guarded. "And dance can paint emotions without a canvas," he countered, a hint of the old, sharp-witted artist surfacing through the gloom. They spoke for a while, a careful, circling conversation about their respective crafts. Leo talked about how a minor key could hold more grief than 1,000 words, and Oliver described how the angle of a wrist could convey a universe of longing. There was an immediate, unspoken understanding between them, the easy rapport of two people who spoke the same essential language. Finally, feeling the ground was solid enough, Leo took a breath. "A few days ago," he said, his eyes fixed on Oliver's, "I was on my way to see my grandfather. I heard something from the old therapy room. I looked, I hope you don't mind. Oliver's posture stiffened instantly. The guardrails went up, his face becoming an impassive mask. He was bracing for the inevitable, the pity, the well-meaning but clumsy condolences. I didn't see brokenness, Leo continued, his voice earnest and direct, cutting through Oliver's defenses. I saw a new kind of art, a form so powerful it doesn't even need sound. It was its own music, a composition about resilience. I'm a composer, Oliver, and I want to write the score for it. A real one. Oliver stared at him, searching his face for any trace of the condescension he so despised. He found none. What he saw was a rare, startling clarity, the pure, unadulterated respect of one artist for another. It wasn't pity that drove Leo, it was resonance. This stranger didn't see a tragedy, he saw a masterpiece in the making. The phrase echoed in Oliver's mind, I want to write the score for it. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a request for collaboration. It was the first time in 18 months that someone had looked at him and seen not what he had lost, but what he was still capable of creating. The tightly coiled knot of pride and pain in his chest slowly, cautiously, began to unwind. Leo began to compose. He didn't just write music. He wove it around their movements, becoming a part of their small, dedicated circle. He would sit in the corner of the dusty therapy room, his laptop open, a small keyboard on his knees, not just watching but listening to the dance. He listened to the whisper of the wheels, the sharp intake of breath before a difficult turn, the unspoken narrative in their synchronized gestures. His music was a revelation. It wasn't the sweeping, classical ballet scores of Oliver's past. It was something new, a hybrid of minimalist piano, resonant cello, and subtle electronic textures that mirrored the metallic grace of the wheelchairs. A gentle, flowing melody would accompany a sequence of fluid arm movements, then swell into a powerful, percussive crescendo to match a series of sharp, coordinated spins. For the first time, Maria and Kyle didn't have to rely on Oliver's counting. They could feel the emotion of the dance in the music itself. It filled the silence, gave their movements a soul, and transformed their practice from a discipline into an expression. Maria's movements lost their last vestiges of self-consciousness, and Kyle, who had always been reserved, began to dance with a raw, powerful vulnerability. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Leo lingered as the others left. He looked hesitant, but his eyes shone with a nervous excitement. Oliver, he said, turning his laptop screen towards him, there's something you need to see. On the screen was a website, sleek and professional, with the title, The Pacific Crest Inclusive Arts Festival. It was a prestigious annual event, renowned on the West Coast for showcasing the powerful and innovative work of artists with disabilities. They have a call for submissions, Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a video of your rehearsal last week. On my phone. The quality is terrible, but the substance is undeniable. I sent it in, anonymously. Oliver stared at the screen, his heart beginning to pound a frantic, unsteady rhythm. You did what? They replied this morning, Leo said, his excitement finally breaking through. He clicked on an email. It was from the festival's artistic director. The words leaped off the page. Deeply moved, a raw and powerful new choreographic voice, we would be honored to formally invite you to perform. The world tilted. A stage, an audience. Lights. The very things he had fled from, the symbols of a life he believed was over. The idea was terrifying, a monstrous wave of hope and fear that threatened to drown him. To present this broken, beautiful thing they had created in the shadows, to the world. It was a possibility so far beyond the realm of his imagination that it felt like a hallucination. He looked at Maria and Kyle, who had paused by the door listening. He saw the shock, the fear, and then slowly a dawning, brilliant flicker of impossible hope in their eyes. The night of the festival, the air backstage was thick with a mixture of hairspray, adrenaline, and palpable fear. The cavernous space buzzed with the controlled chaos of performers and stagehands. Maria, dressed in a simple, elegant black top, was breathing too quickly, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Kyle stared at his own reflection in a darkened monitor, his face pale, his knuckles white where he held a bottle of water. And Oliver felt the ghost of his leg throb with a phantom stage fright he hadn't experienced since his debut as a teenager. He looked down at the empty space where his left leg should be, the tailored black trouser leg pinned neatly up. A wave of raw panic, cold and sickening, washed over him. What were they doing here? They were imposters, residents of a rehab center playing at being artists. The audience out there, they would see the chairs, the missing limb, the physical imperfections. They would see weakness and tragedy. They would clap out of pity. Just then he caught a movement from the wings. It was Leo. He wasn't playing tonight. The score was recorded, a decision they'd made to keep the focus entirely on the dancers. He stood by the heavy velvet curtain, and his eyes found Oliver's across the crowded space. He didn't offer a thumbs up or a cheesy grin. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound trust. It said, "I see you. I believe in this. Now let them see it too." That single, silent gesture was an anchor. Oliver took a deep breath, the panic receding, replaced by a fragile, steely resolve. He wheeled over to Maria and Kyle. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice low but firm. "We are not here to be brave, we are here to dance." The stage lights hit them like a physical blow, hot and blinding. For a moment, all Oliver could hear was a low murmur from the sold-out theater, a collective rustle of curiosity and, yes, pity. He could feel hundreds of eyes on them, on their chairs. Then, from the darkness, the first note of Leo's composition floated out, a single, questioning piano key. As if on cue, the three wheelchairs moved. They didn't just roll forward. They launched into the space with a startling, synchronized grace. They wove and spun, a complex pattern of near misses and perfect unions. The dance told the story they had lived. A sudden fall, the disorientation, the struggle in the darkness, and then the slow, defiant rediscovery of strength. The wheelchairs were no longer medical devices. They were extensions of their will, partners in a story of resilience. The audience fell silent. The murmur of pity was replaced by a stunned, breathless attention. The climax of the piece was a single, breathtaking moment. After a flurry of furious, spinning motion, the three dancers came to an abrupt halt in a tight triangle at the center of the stage. Kyle and Maria leaned back in their chairs, their arms stretched towards the sky in a gesture of pure, unadulterated longing. And Oliver, in the lead, arched his back and raised his arms, his body forming a powerful, triumphant sculpture of defiance. They held the pose, three broken bodies forming a perfect, unbreakable whole. For 3 long, silent seconds, they remained frozen in the spotlight. The silence was absolute, a held breath that filled the entire theater. Then it broke. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar. A wave of sound, raw and emotional, crashed over the stage. People were on their feet, their faces streaked with tears, their clapping a desperate, joyous affirmation. They weren't applauding 3 people in wheelchairs. They were applauding the fierce, indestructible beauty of the human spirit. In the chaotic, jubilant aftermath, as the thunderous applause finally began to subside, the festival's artistic director, a formidable woman with sharp eyes named Alani, rushed backstage. She navigated through the well-wishers and stage crew, her focus entirely on Oliver. When she reached him, she took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "That wasn't a performance," she said, her voice filled with a genuine, breathless awe. "That was a testament." She didn't offer congratulations or platitudes. She offered a future. "Our festival wants to establish a permanent, inclusive dance workshop, a place for this kind of work to grow. We want you to lead it." The offer hung in the air, more stunning than the applause had been. A workshop, a title, a purpose. Oliver could only stare at her, the words failing to form. He saw Maria and Kyle being surrounded by other performers, their faces glowing with a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated joy they hadn't worn in years. He finally managed a nod to Alani before excusing himself, his eyes scanning the crowd for the one person he needed to see. He found Leo leaning against a wall, away from the main throng, simply watching. As Oliver wheeled towards him, Leo pushed off the wall and met him halfway. There were no words. Oliver reached out, and they clasped hands, then pulled each other into a firm, heartfelt embrace. It was a hug that conveyed everything: the shared risk, the mutual respect, the quiet miracle they had wrought together. On the ride back to Willow Creek later that night, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white outside the van window. For the first time in a very long time, Oliver wasn't looking at the passing world and thinking about the life he used to have. The ghost of his pirouette was finally quiet, not erased, but integrated. It was a part of his history, not the entirety of his future. He was already thinking about the workshop, about the first exercise he would teach, about the other Marias, and Kyle's out there waiting for someone to show them they could still dance. He was no longer Oliver, the dancer who lost a leg. He was Oliver, the choreographer. His talent hadn't died in the wreckage on that rainy night. It had simply been waiting for a new stage, a new form, a new reason to burn brighter and more inclusively than ever before.